So we're going to go ahead and get restarted. I hope everybody's had a chance to grab their lunches. If not, feel free to go back, get seconds, get more cookies, whatever. It's my honor to introduce our next speaker, Richard Buangan. He's currently Managing Director for International Media Engagement at the Bureau of Public Affairs at the Department of State. He oversees the Office of International Media Engagement, the Foreign Press Centers, and the Rapid Response Unit in the Bureau of Public Affairs. He joined the U.S. Foreign Service in 1999 and was most recently Chief of Public Diplomacy Section at the U.S. Consulate General in Jerusalem, overseeing press outreach, education, and cultural exchange programs in Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza Strip. Prior to that, he was the Director of Office of Digital Engagement, where he managed the Department of State's flagship social media platforms and created digital strategies for the Secretary of State and the U.S. government's global policy priorities. Richard was a spokesperson and press attaché at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing, as well as staff assistant to Secretaries of State Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice. He's had a number of other overseas assignments, and he holds a BA in political science and economics from St. Edward's University in Austin, Texas. I'm going to take just a second, though, before I hand this off to him to tell you that I met Richard when we started doing work, and when I say we, I mean the Kelley School of Business, in the West Bank. We have 3 different programs that we've done work within the Palestinian territories in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. And Richard and I got to know each other specifically when we worked on a consulting project where we brought together students from the Kelley School's MBA program with the Bethlehem universities. And Richard has been a tireless supporter of getting the business conversation within the small business groups in the West Bank involved in the work that we're doing. He has been one of our biggest cheerleaders. Whenever he talks to the students and talks to the businesses, they go away just incredibly enthusiastic, incredibly excited about working with folks from the United States. And he just continues to be a voice in that region of partnership and collaboration. And I'm lucky to be able to call him a friend. So he agreed to come and speak with us today. So please join me in welcoming Richard Wangan.
Thank you very much, Levon. I think you and your team deserve one more round of applause for this enormous undertaking, this enormous endeavor to create the Business and Peace Forum. Levon and I have been partners in crime of sorts in building opportunity for young Palestinians and businesses through entrepreneurship and business consultation programs, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. I appreciate the warm Indiana Hoosier welcome. The U.S. State Department has sponsored programs, exchange programs that bring countless number of foreign students to the United States, and they spend a few weeks here at the Kelley School, I think through the Coca-Cola Scholarship. I remember meeting some of the Palestinians who have come back after that program, and they are impeccably polite, and they learn a lot of great manners, and they're very respectful. So I'm glad that IU is doing its part of showing the world the friendly face of America. By way of introducing the work of the Department of State, I have to begin by saying that the main objective, the primary purpose of our existence, is to advance peace, security, and American prosperity here and around the world. We do that normally through formal diplomatic relations, which we maintain with over 200 or so countries, but we also invest heavily in informal relationships, public diplomacy, the relationships we have with non-governments, businesses, schools, universities, NGOs, civil society, artists, young people, disadvantaged people, academics, and think tanks, to promote mutual understanding and promote dialogue between ourselves and the rest of the world. I get to say that my job in public diplomacy is much more exciting than the traditional diplomacy because I get to engage with people from all walks of life and discover how Americans and foreigners are alike in so many ways. Today's modern foreign service is much more proactive, engaged, and attuned to societal and economic issues than the diplomacy of the early 20th century, which was squarely concerned with maintaining relations with governments of other countries. Our Foreign Service personnel are working alongside with men and women in uniform in some of the world's most dangerous places, helping secure the peace, combat terrorism, alleviate suffering, and providing economic opportunity to billions around the world. So it's that economic opportunity that I want to talk about today. It gives us a small window into how the State Department is doing its part to highlight the convergence of business and peace. The job of promoting economic opportunity around the world isn't something that the State Department has always done throughout its 200-plus years of history. In recent years, through both Republican and Democratic administrations, we have come to realize that economic prosperity has a direct correlation to maintaining peace and stability in even the most troubled parts of the world. We welcome the notion that there is a really close connection between what entrepreneurs and investors and what we diplomats do in terms of our foreign initiatives and efforts. For us diplomats, the interplay between business and peace is a no-brainer. As the role of non-state actors in international and security affairs increases, making our efforts to respond to global challenges much more complicated, traditional diplomacy, or the relationships we maintain with governments, isn't enough. Secretary Kerry said it best himself. In our world today, there is an intimate connection between the creation of economic opportunity and the potential of political stability or peace, between prosperity and peace, between economic policy and foreign policy, which we at the State Department argue are two sides of the same coin. Economic policy is foreign policy, and foreign policy is economic policy, particularly in the globalized world we're living in today, end quote. But what exactly are the global challenges that we face that diplomacy alone cannot solve? What do businesses and entrepreneurs do to promote peace in war-torn countries? I would look at this as a multifaceted approach. First and foremost, we believe that prosperity abroad means peace and security here at home. Economic opportunity in poor and underdeveloped corners of the world means stability and hopefully a nonviolent approach to pursuing life and liberty. Our challenges aren't just relegated to political borders. They are cross-border. They are interconnected. One of the greatest challenges that greater economic opportunity is meeting head-on right now is countering the rise of violent extremism and the emergence of radical non-state actors who have no agenda outside of the frustrations that they exploit, the bigotry that they espouse, and the religious and ethnic tensions that they inflame. These extremist actions know no boundaries. We see these acts of terrorism manifest themselves around the world, in Western Europe, in the Middle East, and here in the United States. We at the State Department often talk about the large youth demographic in many parts of the world. In the Middle East, South Central and East Asia, 60 to 65% of the populations of these countries are under the age of 30. 50% are under the age of 21. 40% are under the age of 18. Let me stress, half of the populations in many of these regions of the world are under 21. These young people need education. They need opportunity. These young people have told us that they have the same desires and fears as young Americans. They have the same dreams of getting good education, raising a family, and finding a job or starting a business. They want their governments to be responsive to their needs, and they want their political leaders to listen when they grow frustrated. Their needs, unfortunately, aren't being met. Think of what happens when they reach out looking for hope and economic opportunity, and their government and the international community turns the other way. We risk leaving them to the picking of extremists and demagogues. We need to be invested in providing a better future of young people. This is why the U.S. government has been focused on promoting economic development as a means to peace. President Obama and Secretary Kerry often call on the business community to play a more prominent role in helping train and grow the emerging class of innovators, inventors, and entrepreneurs. The U.S. government is putting efforts and resources into public diplomacy and people-to-people engagement to meet these challenges. Through this engagement, we aim to inspire and empower the American way, so people across the world can also be given the opportunity to tap into that same ingenuity and know-how of building prosperity in their own communities. I want to switch gears a little to talk about how foreign audiences see the work that we are doing to strengthen the relationship between business and peace. Speaking as someone who just returned from a diplomatic assignment in Jerusalem and the Palestinian territories, I'm struck at how much the American way of business is admired and respected around the world, including in countries where American foreign policy is widely condemned. When I arrived in Jerusalem in 2013, we were at a low point in Palestinian attitudes towards the American government and American foreign policy. We had just voted no in the United Nations General Assembly to a resolution that would accord Palestine as a non-member observer state. Many Palestinian leaders saw us as two-faced and insincere at being an honest and fair partner in brokering peace. Secretary Kerry's efforts at the time to restart another round of peace negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians were met with scorn and indignation. I asked the predecessor of my job for advice on engaging hostile audiences, and the advice he told me was simple. He told me, learn how to quickly duck when someone throws a shoe at you. And he said that he only had a shoe thrown at him twice, so I'll be lucky if I have it thrown at me once. But I have to say that in the 3 years I was there, I had no shoes thrown at me. These were real frightening times to be an American official talking about how much we wanted to help. Yet I discovered through my initial interactions with Palestinians that as much as they tried, they could not hate us. They could despise our policies, but they had a deep appreciation for our culture and our values. Here is something that gets very little attention in the West: the admiration that foreigners have for the American way of life. The idea that in America, anyone can be anything. You can come as an immigrant or be the son or daughter of immigrants and have just as much opportunity to succeed as your neighbor, regardless of your background, your race, or gender, or creed. In places where I have served around the world, the stories of the lives of inventors and innovators and storytellers like Walt Disney, Steve Jobs, Elon Musk, Bill Gates, and Steven Spielberg were told in classrooms and boardrooms and community centers. In China, I remember one university in the southern part of the country thought it could be as easy as offering a college major on Steve Jobs. If you memorized his life, his teachings, and path to success and got an A, you could be like Steve Jobs too. I wish it were that easy. The fact that Apple and Hewlett-Packard had their humble beginnings in someone's garage, or Yahoo and Google started off as student projects, was something that many foreigners can only dream of, because back home, in their countries, those miracle success stories could never happen. It amazes me that people around the world are still in love with the idea that in America, people can be self-made. The concept of America as a nation of immigrants still rang true for many people, not just in troubled places like the West Bank and Gaza, but in countries experiencing impressive economic growth, like China and India. Many Palestinians sought to kindle a culture of entrepreneurship and innovation by studying us, learning from us, and imitating business models of American companies. After the peace talks between Israelis and Palestinians collapsed a year after it had started, we noticed a rare opportunity at deepening our engagement with the Palestinian public through business and education. We grew our programs in entrepreneurship, women's empowerment, English language learning, sensing that these programs and training opportunities were highly coveted among Palestinians who were growing more disillusioned of a two-state solution and an independent state of Palestine, and now only wanted to build a better life for their families. It was challenging at first because there were clear cultural and value differences that we had to overcome. For example, certain concepts and ideas in entrepreneurship had no easy translation in other languages, such as the word mentorship in Arabic. I know that because once I spoke to a group of Palestinian women talking about the value of networking and finding good mentors, and the translator had a very tough time trying to explain what a mentor was in Arabic. So she just used the English word mentor, and it stuck. So there isn't one word that fits that description completely. While it was still impossible to talk about U.S. foreign policy with Palestinians, every university campus wanted the U.S. government to sponsor an American scholar, or an American English teacher to jumpstart their American Studies program or English language courses. We found a highly capable and creative partner in the Kelley School and their Institute of International Business with several cooperative ventures, one called the Youth Entrepreneurship Livelihood Program, or YELP, that sought to pair Kelley School's MBA students with business students from Bethlehem University and Palestine Polytechnic University in the West Bank to provide free consultation advice for small businesses in Bethlehem and Hebron. The program proved to be wildly successful because it combined expertise. It helped Kelley MBA students learn more about the challenges of growing an economy and innovating in a tough environment such as the West Bank and Gaza. And Palestinian students could learn from their American peers the values behind American entrepreneurship and business operations. The program was seen as a model for American and Palestinian partnership, which served disadvantaged businesses that lacked access to resources, education, and expertise. This year, Indiana University and the State Department's Middle East Partnership Initiative, or MEPI, launched the Bethlehem Business Incubator Project in the West Bank, housed in the Bank of Palestine, the largest private and commercial bank in the Palestinian territories. The idea is simple: create a space in which innovative ideas and startups in the West Bank can take root, using talents, resources, and skills of U.S. and Palestinian academia and the financial sector. Supporting the growing class of entrepreneurs and startups in the West Bank wasn't the only priority of the U.S. government. We also focused on playing a part on alleviating the suffering in Gaza, particularly through economic opportunity. The war in 2014 between the terrorist group Hamas and Israel left countless number of Palestinians in Gaza homeless and destroyed entire blocks of apartments and businesses. When the conflict stopped and residents tried to resume their normal daily lives amid the rubble and ruin, we met a bright young Gazan woman named Miriam, who came up with the great idea to help people recover from the war. In her fourth year of studies at a local university in Gaza City, Miriam was frustrated with the crawling pace of rebuilding, frustrated at the de facto authorities, Hamas, the international community, and the Israeli Defense Forces for not being able to come up with some way to increase humanitarian assistance. Miriam wanted to figure out the most efficient way of helping her family and her neighbors get from point A to point B, not just to travel, but to remove rubble and debris. So she created a ride-sharing app. It's like if Uber and Lyft existed in war-torn war zones. This app would match riders and drivers and help them navigate around destroyed neighborhoods and block streets using crowdsourced data. We sent Miriam to the Global Entrepreneurship Summit in Morocco a few years ago, and she was selected to sit next to Vice President Biden to talk about her work. Miriam has since found investors to help grow her idea and started her own business. She's since returned to Gaza to help her people in the reconstruction. In the West Bank, we are also seeking to get young Palestinians interested in math and applied sciences so they could consider careers as engineers, scientists, and architects. One of our most popular programs we started a few years ago was the Science, Technology, and Entrepreneurship program for high school students. Working with a local Palestinian NGO partner, we brought together the expertise of NASA and the Smithsonian's Air and Space Museum to expose students to hands-on learning, culminating with a national science fair in which 10 winners would travel to the United States to spend a summer at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, NASA, and the Smithsonian's Air and Space Museum. So what does the future look like? Looking forward, what can we expect given the presidential transition later this year? And should we hope for the U.S. government to continue to protect that space for businesses to play a meaningful role in peace building and peacemaking? I would argue that as long as businesses continue to embrace its corporate responsibility, tap new markets, identify collaborative ventures with foreign partners, train an emerging class of entrepreneurs and innovators, the U.S. government will support you. Just at the State Department alone, on a government-to-government level, we constantly push our counterparts in other nations to enact needed regulatory reforms. to invest in their schools, to protect intellectual property, to end corruption, and make the public sector a facilitator, not a barrier, not an obstacle, to the creation and success of new businesses. We are urging our partners worldwide to develop healthy entrepreneurial ecosystems by expanding access to capital, fostering innovation and risk-taking, promoting transparency, ensuring the rule of law. In short, by creating the infrastructure of both good governance and open markets. That is why the State Department works directly with entrepreneurs overseas. We have established centers in Pakistan, Cambodia, Zambia, Kenya that provide training, mentorship, and access to technology to women entrepreneurs. We've dedicated our resources to help the next generation of innovators in the Mekong Delta region of Vietnam and help them to be able to preserve that area as well as to grow startups. We've sent teams of public and private sector leaders on innovation roadshows across Asia to strengthen ties and support new business formation in critical and fast-growing regions. An annual event that has become one of the signature highlights of the White House and their commitment to building a strong global entrepreneur network is the Global Entrepreneurship Summit, which is now in its 6th year. India has committed to host the summit next year as the new presidential administration begins. I'm hopeful of the future prospects of business and peace in continuing the discussion as to how government and the private sector can cooperate and find ways for industries and commerce to build peace. Not just peace agreements, but a lasting peace that ensures a better life for people who don't have the same access to education and resources as one enjoys in developed first world countries. We as concerned stakeholders need to expand our thinking of what are the results we are trying to achieve. If American diplomats seek an end to conflict and to spread democracy across the world, we should depend on the business sector to create an economic environment conducive to ending war and encouraging civic participation. If businesses want to expand and grow overseas, they should count on the government to work with other governments to protect investments, personnel, and property that would mitigate the risk that businesses take when opening up shop in other parts of the world. I want to close with the story of an entrepreneur from Rwanda, Jean Bosco Nzimana, who is the founder and CEO of Habona Limited, a company that uses biomass and waste to develop eco-friendly fuels that are used in rural Africa. He told President Obama not too long ago the challenges he faced in business and growing up in rural villages of Rwanda. He said, and I quote, "I used to spend countless hours in the forest collecting firewood for my parents and teaching and fetching water. And that was not just me, but dozens of other children in Africa who are facing the same challenges. They are involved in laborious activities just to help their parents have a meal instead of going to school. So as I was growing up, I kept thinking about something that I can do to help these families have access to other alternative fuels that they can use to replace charcoal that they have been using for so many years. So I came up with an idea of a green approach, whereby we collect natural waste and then we turn that into affordable and environmentally friendly products in the form of briquettes and biogas that people can then use, which can improve health and sanitation in homes. As we started, it has been 2 years, and I have employed more than 25 people, giving them permanent jobs. And we are trying to expand to other areas of the country so we can continue to improve sanitation, as well as providing these kind of alternative fuels which can improve health and mitigate climate change in the country and in Africa in general. We owe it to young optimists and builders like Jean Bosco to hear their stories and find ways to help people like him develop the tools to succeed in life. Jean Bosco in Rwanda and other young men and women in other parts of the world could choose destruction or could choose life. And these people choose life. They choose hope. I hope that this forum will inspire us to find ways to be peacemakers and peace builders so we can help more people like Jean Bosco choose life. Thank you very much. So we take a few questions. Yes, sir, Ambassador.
Okay, we're going to microphone.
Thank you, Richard. That was tremendous. I neglected to tell people that I too was a career foreign service officer. Just two quick comments. With regard to your difficulty in explaining to the Palestinian the word mentor, I think Josh will back me up on this. It's a good thing your interpreter chose the English word mentor and not a French word menteur, for example.
Very good point.
Which means liar.
Yeah.
So, words do matter.
They matter.
And then on the question of the traditional diplomacy of the 20th century, maybe I'm being a little sensitive here, I would argue, to correct the record a little bit for those in the audience, but also globally, that certainly in the last quarter of the 20th century that I practiced diplomacy in, it was very much beyond just engagement with governments, but also engagement with civil society, with individual citizens in American libraries and so on. In fact, the U.S. Agency for International Development had well over 10,000 career development officers to work around the world, to include in Afghanistan in the late 70s when I was there. And for public diplomacy had its own agency, the U.S. Information Agency. So there was a traditional diplomacy, and I would argue we really need to get back to the resourcing of it so we can do it just as well as you clearly have done in your term.
Thank you. No, I agree, and I didn't mean to underplay the role that traditional diplomacy played in terms of promoting a lot of these core issues and universal issues that we as Americans hold dear, like human rights. That has happened for decades. But I think that what we've seen in the last 10 to 20 years is the emergence of our attention to these global priorities that traditional diplomacy, or just diplomacy in general, hasn't really focused on, like climate change. I remember when Hillary Clinton was in the State Department, and she had a special envoy to clean burning cook stoves, right? Because there were millions of women millions of families in rural countries, like rural areas like Africa and in Southeast Asia, that were still using dirty coal to burn fuel that would be inside their houses that would cause pollution and risk their health. She had a special envoy for that. So I think that in the last few years, we've seen the emergence of diplomacy and development playing a more prominent role in identifying some of these non-political, non-sort of areas that you alluded to. Thank you. Yes, sir.
I wanted to say, really, that last story resonated with me because we at the Sagamore Institute had John Bosco over. He actually spoke to us there. So there's just for people to know that some of these stories are just not out there. They have real flesh and blood to them. So I thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
The question that I have to ask, though, is when you mention that difference out there, it almost seems, I guess I'm concerned that the difference is being downplayed. You just want a job and you do your work and we go on. What I'm concerned about is that I think there is in fact a real philosophical difference. And it seemed to me, rather than downplaying that, it could be vociferously argued as if we do have something you can bring about. Like, for instance, I always look back at somebody like Amartya Sen's development at freedom. That's a major thrust to say that freedom is important, does have value. So I'm saying, I guess maybe we shouldn't shy away from that, acknowledge the fact that these are real differences, and then suggest where, in fact, there are advantages to a more metaphysical understanding of the meaning of human freedom and why we think it's important to celebrate.
Yes, I completely agree. And I think that the concept of freedom and human rights and a lot of these values which we hold dear have different definitions around the world, depending on which culture or background you take. And we found that what people want us to do is they want to have a conversation. They want us to hear what their concept, what does freedom mean to them, When I was in Jerusalem, freedom meant something different between Palestinians and Israelis. To Palestinians, freedom was justice. To Israelis, freedom was the freedom to walk on the street without being killed or stabbed, which is still happening to this day. But you're absolutely right, and I think that we have to start having a conversation and to listen more and to acknowledge that there are different definitions out there, philosophical definitions, if you will. Yes, sir.
Excuse me. Hello. Thank you for your time and speaking to us. I'm a former State Department intern myself, and as an economics major, I got really passionate about looking at black markets and looking at sort of the black markets perspective on countering violent extremism. You have a lot of people turning to black or sometimes, the gray markets because they don't have those other opportunities. Now, yeah, they might be, you might have some demographics that go actively into perpetuating violent extremism, but you also have people who go into that and wind up being exploited by it. I mean, basically, human trafficking springs to mind, especially in its most vile form, sex trafficking. That is a huge revenue source for groups like ISIL. So could you speak to the confluence of prosperity and security, not just as a way of keeping people, usually men, from going down that dark path, but also people, usually women, from going down that dark path as victims?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I'm glad you brought that up. Human trafficking, in particular, trafficking of women, trafficking of young girls, is a big concern at the State Department. In fact, every year we publish a congressional report that addresses specifically trafficking in various parts of the world. It causes our neighbors, our allies, and our diplomatic partners a little bit of discomfort because we have some real diplomatic engagement, but some of these countries also have some real issues managing and preventing human trafficking across borders. A lot of it, I think, is sort of two-faced, or twofold, where you have the government-to-government relationships, the law enforcement cooperation. We have various bureaus and agencies at the State Department and at the U.S. government in general that are working together to work with governments and Interpol and other law enforcement agencies to stop human trafficking as it happens. And then the sort of public campaign around it where, like you said, we're trying to work with members of the public through NGOs. We have a relationship with numerous organizations that help us talk to women and exploited individuals on what are the dangers of being trafficked. I mean, at the end of the day, as you noted, it's about economic necessity. I mean, a lot of these actions are a result of economic necessity, having no idea what they're getting themselves into. You see that in a lot of countries, and I think that we have to play a larger role with the civil society and NGO community to help highlight that, so it decreases the risk of people from getting involved in that. Thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
Hi, I'm a senior. I'm studying international business, and I really appreciate you coming in to talk to us about this. It's very interesting. And you made a comment that I found particularly interesting about immigrants and how we're perceived as this exemplary leader in the business world, and that America is seen as a place where you can be self-made, largely because of our history of being welcoming to immigrants. So given current issues, if the U.S. isn't perceived as being as welcoming to immigrants or refugees, how might that affect other people's perception of the American dream or its achievability?
Yeah, that's a very good question. You see that playing out, especially during the election. It does make a difference, and it makes our work harder when we talk about our history and our background, who we are as a nation, because you have political rhetoric out there that suggests that we are not friendly towards immigrants. But I would look at our record, right? I mean, my parents came over as immigrants. A lot of Foreign Service officers are now coming in through the ranks. They're first and second generation Americans. A lot of them have experiences and stories to tell. You also have a lot of native speakers or heritage speakers that are coming up that speak the language of their parents or their grandparents, Chinese, Arabic, Filipino. And I would say that the best articulation of our values is the acts that we demonstrate. So the very fact that I'm out there talking as an American official, it sets people's heads tilting a little bit because they're trying to figure out who I am and where I'm from. I can't begin to tell you how many times, when I was in the West Bank, people first thought that I was a diplomat from China or from Japan. Really, because China has a lot of investments in the West Bank and they have a lot of factories. So when someone goes to their neck of the woods, they automatically think that there's a Chinese diplomat that's out there trying to promote some business deal or something. But then when you explain to them who I am and what my background is, it's amazing how very little they realize that Americans can come from all walks of life, and that that my experience is different from the experience of my neighbor or someone who may not share the same ethnic background. And I think that we shouldn't take it for granted. Number one, we have Hollywood to thank for helping, propagate that stereotype of Americans. But Hollywood propagates a lot of unhelpful stereotypes, like the fact that we all have guns or the fact that there's a lot of racial tension in the United States. These are some of the challenges that we as public diplomacy officers have to overcome. But it's hard because, you can't deny the fact that the Second Amendment guarantees people to bear arms. There is a history of seclusion and exclusion that we as Americans. I'm very proud to talk about the Chinese Exclusion Act, or the period of slavery, or the period of civil rights, as moments of lessons for us. You'll go to other countries around the world, like China, or in Western Europe, who are very hesitant to talk about those experiences in public. I look at the election this year as an opportunity for us to talk about who we are as a people. Now, obviously, it's very difficult to talk about some of the issues that are coming out in the campaign. But it's an opportunity for me as an American and to talk about how, despite what's going on in the political rhetoric, I'm still who I am, and there are people who are able to succeed because of the opportunities that are afforded to them. So.
I'm sorry, I just have to follow up on that because it's really important that the State Department has a deliberate, proactive policy of seeking out African Americans, Hispanic Americans, Native Americans to apply for the Foreign Service so that the Foreign Service is more represented. As it turns out, a lot of Asian Americans apply, which is good, but not so much in the African American, Hispanic American, and Native American communities.
That's true. Although I have to add that in China, we have a lot of African Americans who grew up, they picked up Chinese in high schools and learning growing up. And so it's really a treat when you see African Americans, diplomats traveling to China, giving full interviews in Mandarin Chinese and being just very fluent. And you can close your eyes and they sound just like native speakers. And that phenomenon, again, is shifting. So, the more that we demonstrate the diversity of this country, the more it really turns heads when we try to make our point overseas. Are we good? Thank you very much. I look forward to keeping in touch.